Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being part of this virtual event. My name is Ken Corts, and I have the great pleasure of being the Interim Dean of the Rotman School of Management. While all of us, panelists, audience, and moderator alike, join this webinar from a variety of physical locations, we're brought together today by our connection to the Rotman School and to the University of Toronto. And as such, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Welcome to the 10th webinar in our series, Managing Uncertainty, Adapting to and Learning from the COVID-19 Crisis. Our goal with this series is to bring the Rotman community together to offer our evidence-based perspectives and advice to help you cope with the dramatic changes that are taking place as a result of the pandemic. Today, the topic is the future of cities, urban life and work beyond COVID-19. In March, many of us thought the shift to remote work would be a temporary phenomenon and would probably have been shocked then to know that sitting here today in July, we'd still be largely working remotely. And of course, we now know also that some of these changes to the way organizations view remote work are becoming permanent. Shopify and others have, during the pandemic, pledged to make this new arrangement with increased remote work a permanent change for most of their employees, which raises some real questions about cities. So we normally think about cities as hubs of commerce and housing, the arts and entertainment. And with this increase in remote work, will that dynamic change? Will that change permanently? Is this a major body blow to the idea of a vibrant downtown? Will cities be able to recover? These are some of the topics that we're going to explore today with our two guests. Joining me to talk about this subject are Richard Florida and Shauna Brail. Shauna Brail is an associate professor at the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. As an economic geographer and urban planner, her research focuses on the transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. Shauna is a senior associate at the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and a faculty affiliate at the U of T Transportation Research Institute. She's held a number of roles across the university, including director of the Urban Studies program, associate director for partnerships and outreach at the School of Cities, and presidential advisor on urban engagement. Prior to joining U of T, she worked in management consulting in the Ontario provincial government. Richard Florida is university professor at the Rotman School of Management and at the School of Cities at U of T. He also serves as chief urbanist at Rotman's Creative Destruction Lab and is a distinguished fellow at NYU's Schack Institute of Real Estate. He's the author of more than 10 books, including The Rise of the Creative Class, and more than 100 book chapters and authors in academic journals. He's co-founder and editor-at-large of City Lab, the world's leading publication devoted to cities and urbanism. He previously taught at Carnegie Mellon, George Mason, and Ohio State universities, and has been a visiting professor at Harvard and MIT, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He earned his bachelor's degree from Rutgers College and his PhD from Columbia University. So welcome you both, Richard and Shauna. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you.
To the audience, I'd say before we begin the discussion, I'll just remind you that you're able to submit questions along the way through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be collecting and monitoring those, and in roughly the second half of the hour, we'll spend some time responding to those questions that are submitted through that button at the bottom of the screen. So with that, let's kick it off. Shauna, this is a question for both of you, but I'll ask Shauna to respond first. Just broadly, what impact do you see COVID-19 having had on cities?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for including me in the webinar and in what I think is a really important and fascinating conversation, and one in which we're still very much learning where it is we're going to and how it is we're going to get there. I also want to acknowledge the very devastating impacts of coronavirus globally, more than 13 million cases and nearly 600,000 deaths around the world, including over 8,000 in Canada. And so I think the first thing we have to recognize is that this has been an enormously devastating pandemic. It's a public health crisis that has also led to economic destruction and the amplification of inequality. If we look at both the spread of cases who's getting sick, who's dying, and who's most affected by this very sort of dramatic change and by the pandemic. But in turn, it's also a reimagining of what could be if we leverage the strengths of cities, if we bring together people and communities and neighborhoods and organizations and businesses and institutions to really think about how do we make progress, how do we build greater prosperity, a lot of talk about how do we build back better than where we were before. And if we look specifically at the urban form of cities, a lot of discussion about the challenges of density. We now know that density is not the devil here. The real problem in terms of the spread of illness has to do with overcrowding more than density, and also really shines a light on how we get around our cities, so mobility and public realm, and how we use the spaces in our cities, and how we might redefine and adapt those spaces in our cities to think through how they can help us in adapting to this change. And so I'll just close this question by saying that COVID gives cities a kind of a short, rapid runway to create adaptation, to develop strategies for managing now. This is temporary, but we also have a pretty long runway now to prove that we're able to adapt, that we're able to become more resilient, and that we're able to create a more prosperous but also more equal society.
Thanks. Richard?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ken, and it's fantastic to have you now. We know you have served the Rotman School as interim dean. Congratulations, and thank you for doing it. Shauna, it's great to share the virtual stage with you as well. You know, it's coming up on my 12-year anniversary in Toronto, and maybe I took Toronto too for granted the first dozen years, but man, it's good to be here. That's all I have. As an American who took his sabbatical last term, as Ken knows, it's good to be back in Toronto. And, you know, I think the way that we've dealt with this is pretty amazing. And so when I think about this, the first thing I think about is, you know, the first strike of this virus, when we didn't know much about it. And every day I would pick up a digital version of the newspaper, and I would read that New York was dead and it was the end of cities and London would collapse and all this other stuff. And that's just nonsense. It's just complete and utter nonsense. New York, for example, and it's interesting, nobody writes that about Toronto, but moreover, if the epicenter of the crisis is now Miami and Houston, we haven't seen one person write Miami is dead or Houston is dead or Phoenix is dead. So it's just very interesting. But, you know, New York in just the past couple of decades has survived the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Superstorm Sandy, the 2008 financial crisis. And if you look back in history, you know, the cholera epidemics that struck most North American cities, certainly New York, London, the plagues in Europe, which killed like 40 to 50% of people who lived in cities. Cities come back pretty strong. And in fact, the more we've gone into this, the more I actually think cities will come back stronger than any. One of the things I would say that I have, my great error, if I do admit I made many, is that I have consistently underestimated the resiliency of cities. You know, when I was writing my book, Rise of the Creative Class, that you kindly mentioned, people said, no, you know, after 2001 and the economic tech bubble and the terrorist attacks, cities were dead and everybody moved to the suburbs. And after 2008, they said the same thing, and I tempered. You know, our colleague Nate Bam-Snow at the Rotman School has shown this period after 2010 was the biggest period for the boom of cities. And the more I think about this, and the more we have time, I actually think that cities are going to come back stronger. And if you ask me, it might sound counterintuitive, we can dig into this. I think that the New Yorks and Londons, and certainly the Torontos of the world, will be just fine. I worry deeply about second and third tier cities, particularly those Sunbelt cities now that everyone said was going to be great and it's going to be fine and the virus is going to burn off. I really worry about small cities, and I'm terribly worried about suburbs. So I think as this thing plays out, by the way, I think the big shifts, just for a second, we can move on. We're certainly going to see a big shift to remote work, and we should talk more about that. I think that's something that will stick around for a lot. I've always been a remote worker, so it makes sense to me. I think the one that we don't talk about is that we're going to see a big shift to remote education, not just in the university context. I think in overall, we're going to see more people using online ways to educate their kids, which I think is going to be very fascinating and quite disruptive. And I do think, echoing what Shauna said, I think we have, for the first time in my life, I've been doing this for a long time, an ability to make our cities and suburbs and communities much better, both in a question of resiliency and equity, which we can talk about, but moreover, this reknitting. One of the legacies of the Industrial Revolution is we separated where we work from where we live and where we do stuff. This idea that urbanists talk about a 15-minute neighborhoods, it may have sounded kooky 2 or 3 years ago, but this idea that we could live in, it's what I've been doing for the past 3 or 4 months, and I find it just an amazingly great way to live, and many more people do. So I think we have a big inflection point here where we could remake communities better.
Great, thanks. You mentioned remote work, so let's dig in there, Richard. So obviously the pandemic has sent a lot of workers home, and many businesses are embracing work from home culture and remote work, with some announcing plans to make that move permanent. Do you think that'll have a lasting impact on cities?
Yeah, and I'm coming to believe it will actually strengthen cities. So I think the best data we have from the various surveys is, now most professional and knowledge workers, which compose anywhere from 1/3 to about 40% of the workforce, depending on how you estimate that. Most of us are working from home. And the best estimates we have is about half of us will remain working from home. And that's up from about 5% before the pandemic. So let's say about 20% of the workforce is working from home. I think the people who are most likely to work from home will tend to be people like me or you, or maybe not you because you actually have to run a school, Ken, or Shauna. But what I'm saying about our demographic cohort broadly, people who may be married, may have families, may have children in the household, even though children can be a distraction. We are more likely to work from home, mainly because our careers are established and our personal networks are established. I think the people who are least likely to work from home, who are among, not like frontline service workers who can't work from home, 50% of the workforce, more or less, will be younger workers. And I think younger workers, are Rotman graduates, U of T graduates. They have to not only go to an urban center because there's economic opportunity, they have to develop a personal network. It's very hard to do that remotely. And I've been talking to a lot of people, almost to a person. They've told me all of their job promotions have come from a personal contact, not from a virtual contact. It's from someone they've met and gotten to know. And I think the other thing that will drive young people back to the office is the fact that most young people in cities can't afford to live in big apartments. They're squinched in with 4, 5, 6 other roommates. They're going to need a space to work. And then finally, they're going to want to be able to meet other young people. They're going to want to meet boys and girls and go out on dates and develop friendships. So for all those reasons, I think we'll see a demographic separation. I think that some people, mid-career people, will say, look, the heck with this expensive city business. I'm going to move to a less expensive suburb. And in fact, I'm teaching an online course for Rotman. One of our assignments is going to be remote work strategies for communities outside of Toronto and the GTA. I think that will be a trend. But for younger people and very advantaged people and people who run high-tech businesses or media businesses or finance business or real estate business, cities are going to become even more attractive. So I think it's going to cut both ways.
Okay, interesting. Of course, related to many of these trends are questions about public transit, which is something Shauna has some expertise in and mentioned in her opening comments. So Shauna, can you speak to that for a minute? What will this move to, what will the effects of the pandemic broadly and the move to remote work, how will that affect the way we move around the city and the way we think about using public transit?
Well, first of all, I want to just build on something Richard said, which is that people have predicted for years, for decades, that cities would die as a result of the car, as a result of technology, the internet, that we wouldn't need to be together anymore. And in fact, what we've seen is the exact opposite of that, that cities have grown stronger and stronger. And just like the coronavirus isn't going to kill the city, I don't think it's going to kill the commute, unfortunately, either. And people will still need to be commuting because they will still be going to their offices. Maybe not every day like they were before. Maybe they'll go during staggered hours, but they'll still need to get there somehow. And in in a big city, we need people to take transit in order to relieve congestion on our streets. So even if you happen to drive your own private vehicle to work, you're actually better off if many other people are taking transit. And so we need to make sure that transit is safe, that it's affordable, that it services the neighborhoods and the parts of the city that need that service most, whether it's because people cannot afford a private vehicle, whether they've made the choice intentionally that transit is actually makes many other people better off, including themselves. But emotion is a very powerful motivator, and we've seen transit ridership fall completely off a cliff. In most big cities, about something like 85 to 90% of ridership declined as people stopped going to work and stopped going to school and stopped going out. In the city of Toronto, the projection is that they'll be able to build back to about 30% capacity in September if things continue to improve the way they are. So still a decline of 70% in ridership, which is very significant, both from a revenue perspective for the TTC, which relies on almost 60% of its total operating costs come from revenues. But also because we need to be able to create safe ways for people to get around. And we can look to other cities, we can look to Taipei, and we can look to Singapore, we can look to Tokyo to see how their transit systems have continued to operate, but we can also look to San Francisco, which reduced bus service dramatically, and which now is the city and the transit agency is coming out and saying it may be years before we're able to afford to bring those services back. And so we need to, one, think of ways to find new sources of funding for transit. We need to make sure that if we're cutting transit services because of a lack of operating revenues, that we think about the impacts and the socio-spatial impacts of those choices. But what we're also seeing cities do is really kind of expedite the planning of cycling infrastructure. So creating more and safer routes for cyclists so that people who choose not to take transit have another way to move around. It typically works a lot better in a denser urban environment than in suburban areas where speed limits are high and roads are very wide and distances traveled can be much longer. But we've again seen many cities around the world, particularly in Europe, really make that transition to create new ways, new active transportation opportunities for people to move around. And again, we also have to think about, pedestrians and how do we make spaces safe, and this sort of concept of the 15-minute neighborhood. Not everybody is going to live within 15 minutes of where they work and where they go to school and where they sort of recreate. But if we can create more thinking about mixed use neighborhoods, again, density plays a real role there. That's another piece that comes into play.
Yeah, to build on what Shauna said, I think that there is, whether it's true or not, and the jury's out on this, there's this MIT study from Jeff Harris, who's a very smart guy, he's a medical doctor who teaches in economics, says transit was a big factor in New York City, but that's based on secondary associations, not evidence. Whether it's true or not, and there's all sorts of, people are scared to death of getting on transit. So that's just the reality. And I think the big question that Shauna got at is that transit is really an equity issue. And just spend a minute on this. I think that one of the big things when we think about cities or legacy of the Industrial Revolution is this idea of a central business district. It's sort of the last thing that the Industrial Revolution has left us with. This giant central business district. We've offshored the factories, we've automated the factories, we've made them more efficient, but we still have this giant central business district with office towers, the physical manifestations of corporate greatness, where thousands upon thousands and millions of workers get on trains and transit and go there every day. And by the way, it's not just fear of transit. People are even more scared of elevators. The elevator is a bigger fear vector than a train or a bus or a piece of transit. So now people are going to say, well, why do I have to do that? If I'm a knowledge worker, I can work pretty effectively from home. And from a business point of view, we know productivity is pretty good when people work from home. They have less distraction. And it's a lot cheaper when people work from home because we don't have to pay for that expense. And for commercial real estate developers will get their oxes gored, but that's another issue for another day. So I think what we're going to see is over time less of that. And there'll be less people commuting, professional knowledge workers. And Shauna mentioned this 15-minute neighborhood. There'll be more people living and working and spending more time with their family, good or bad, or you can see it in Toronto today. You can just see it in our day-to-day life in Toronto today. I think the equity issue is that there'll be many people who can't do that. And 50% of our workforce are basically frontline service workers who can't afford to live where they work, have to commute to where they work, whether they work in a healthcare setting or a service industry setting or a warehouse setting. And so I think transit becomes a big equity issue. And the question there becomes, how do we balance that? I only hope, by the way, that we can use this opportunity to fix the problem with cars. I think that cities now have to say enough's enough. We've seen how much cleaner and safer our cities can be without cars. It's better for the environment. It's better for our health. It's better for our safety. And cities like Toronto just have to bite the bullet and do everything we need: congestion pricing, better road pricing, to make sure that we don't get as congested as we were.
Great, thanks. I want to focus a little bit on what some of these changes in the pandemic mean for the role of cities in creating a healthy business climate. Are there things that business leaders should be advocating for with, maybe government and the public sector? Things that business leaders should be advocating for as a response to the pandemic that would create the kind of city that would be most advantageous to kind of a healthy business environment being created in the city? I'll start back with you, Richard.
Well, yeah, let me start here, because I think we pat ourselves on the back in Toronto. And certainly I feel very proud of Toronto because we've managed this very well. We've gotten our cases down to virtually nothing. People obeyed physical distancing pretty well. I mean, compared to most other cities, we look really good. One thing, though, and that I see happening in US cities and not happening here, is that business is driving the economic recovery effort. If you look at New York City and you look at the degree of attention New York City business is paying to not just reopening, but the idea of how do you recover? How do you make sure the MTA, the transit authority, is funded? How do you make sure that the city's fiscal crisis is addressed? How do you make sure it is just a different ball game? And here I think in Canada, rightly or wrongly, I'm not trying to make a value judgment, business has kind of stepped way back and said, let political leadership lead this. Nothing wrong with that. So I think the most important thing business can do is be much more involved in being one, not the only participant, but one participant in thinking about how to build a not only more competitive city and more economically robust city, but a healthier city, a more resilient city, and a more inclusive city. And that's one change I'd like to see happen in Toronto and Canada. Our business community, by the way, that's exactly what I teach. It sounds so silly, and it's not meant as an advertisement. That is precisely what I teach at the Robbins School. So that is like the main track of my course. It's called Business in the City. And it's how business can be involved in a productive way, not an extractive way, in helping along with other stakeholders to build better, more inclusive cities.
Great. Shauna, do you want to share some thoughts on this? What should business leaders be advocating for to help build a more economically vibrant city in light of the pandemic?
So the first and most urgent thing that business leaders need to advocate for is a safe return to schools, particularly for younger children and for working parents with school-aged children who are completely blindsided and unable to do their jobs and to manage the work-life balance and the responsibilities of care because there is no school. We need to think about how do we get our children back into school safely. It's not just for the parents, it's also for the children, obviously, because of the need for them both to learn, but also to have those social experiences. And so I think that is absolutely sort of the thing that we need to yell about the loudest right now. The other thing, though, that businesses can advocate for is anything that's good for your own employees and for your customers is probably also good for the city. We need to ensure a healthy business climate, and the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem needs to be healthy in order to do that. I know that Richard talked about the US sort of example of business leaders really sort of taking the charge, and both through philanthropy, but also through really civic activity and civic leadership. You mentioned in the introduction that I worked in consulting, and my first role when I graduated from my PhD was at the Boston Consulting Group, where I worked with David Pico. And David Pico, of course, is American. He passed away I think over a decade ago now. But an American who came from that sort of spirit of business activism, philanthropy, and civic action. And so after SARS really devastated Toronto's tourism industry and sector, David Pico championed SARS Stock and Luminato, the arts and cultural festival that still operates to this day, and also the Roots of Civic Action, an organization meant to bring firms together and business leaders together to advocate for public good and for communal good, is something that actually came out of SARS, and that came out of leadership in the business community. And I think we need to find those sort of new, inspiring, and dedicated leaders to help bring together the ecosystem, but also to help make sure we get to the next place.
Yeah, let me build on that, because this is incredibly important, especially as we're doing this event hosted by the Rotman School. I mentioned this is what I teach in my class, and I'm also finishing, it's just been put on hold for folks who care, and I'll send this to you, an article for the Harvard Business Review about this. I think this needs to be a main subject in business schools. I think that's the issue. And that we need to train business leaders. And that's why I was so happy to join the Rotman School from a previous career in urban planning and in public policy. Business leaders are trained in every other dimension of the business enterprise except location and community engagement. We don't train. We don't train business leaders. We don't train boards of directors. And I've learned this through a dozen years in the Rotman School. I would argue that community engagement and location is the central element of corporate strategy, not an add-on. It is the most expensive decision a corporation makes. When it goes bad, oh boy, it goes terribly bad. We've seen this. We've seen that with Amazon. We've seen it with other high-tech companies. We've seen it with the debate over Sidewalk Labs. And business leaders just don't understand. And when you look at Amazon, they think, okay, let's find a location that's best for Amazon. And it causes communities a lot of expense, a lot of pain, and a lot of disruption. You know, one argument I think is that we need a C-suite position around location. And it's not just a CIO and a CFO and a CMO. This needs to be a C-suite position in understanding for a global enterprise the importance of location and community engagement and how to manage this diverse group of stakeholders. It's not just community do-goodism, which I think has been a big part of this. It is about managing an enterprise. And one of the things I found, and Ken, you know this, but folks listening in, if you look around the University of Toronto and the Rotman School, you cannot find a better collection of people who do this from the point of view of entrepreneurship, like Josh Gans and Ajay Agarwal, real estate, like Will Strange and Napalm Snow and others across the university. So I think empowering business leaders and equipping them, not only CEO level leaders and C-suite leaders and boards of directors, in how to better understand and manage their communities is just a key thing going forward that business schools need, like ours, but other business schools need to take on.
Great, thanks. So Richard, I wanted to kind of follow up with you about thinking about, as we kind of get into a new phase now where we're starting to see plans for reopening and we are, there's kind of a change in the air and we feel like we're headed into a new phase to some extent. What should businesses and employees be thinking about and planning for as we, as this evolves and as we start into a little bit more of a back to work or reopening kind of phase?
So we know a lot now about what not to do that we didn't know just a couple of months ago. And put this in a big picture framework. I've been arguing since March that we've been solving the last problem and fighting the last battle. So in March, we were talking about we have to bolster medical care capability. We have to prepare more ICU beds, and that's incredibly important. But I was arguing there that economic development officials, transit officials, those who are not on the medical front lines need to be developing reopening plans. Of course, nobody paid attention to that. And then it came time to reopen and we developed these little checklists. Here's how we're going to reopen. Now, I think the most important thing is that we have to be, this is like natural disaster recovery. That's exactly what the analog is. And people are now saying, well, what do we need to do to reopen, and what do we not need to do? So we shouldn't be opening bars and other things indoor. That's just silly. We should be putting stuff outdoors and getting ready, as Shauna said, to get our schools open, which we can do in Toronto, which we probably can't do in most US cities. But really, I think we have to be focusing on long run recovery. And I think this is the point that most cities and communities and business leaders looking out, given the fiscal cliff, right? The fiscal nightmare cities are looking at, and looking at the longer run economic impacts. What do we need to do to develop a recovery strategy for cities and communities and metropolitan regions, not just the city of Toronto, but the GTA, to make sure this recovery gets on the best possible track, but also is equitable? And one of the things that really scares me is if we don't do this, if we're not strategic and intentional about equity and inclusivity, we could come out of this with even greater inequity. Most people think, well, we're going to patch it, but no, if we don't do things. So let me go back to Shauna's point about schools. What do you hear now when people are talking about schools? Well, people who are affluent are saying, I'm lining up tutors. I heard from one of my colleagues who lives in Los Angeles, where they just said the schools won't be open in the fall. They'll be remote learning. This person's significant other is a school teacher. She's gotten 10 requests to set up pod schools for wealthy people. So affluent people will have the technology to do online learning, but they'll be able to supplement that with personalized tutoring. But less advantaged people will not only be able to not have online tutoring, they might not even be able to have online capability. So I think getting ready to get schools up and running is critical for social cohesion. And the Swedish strategy, you can debate it ad infinitum, whether it worked or not. The one thing they said is they had to keep their elementary schools open at all costs. To everything else, that was the core of the strategy to create normalcy. They couldn't close down their elementary schools. So I think making sure we do everything in our power, as Shauna said, to keep our schools open, which we can do in Toronto, would be critical.
Yeah, and Shauna, I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to speak to some of these questions about kind of the inequalities and things that have come up throughout the conversation. What happens if we don't take this opportunity to build back better? We don't take this opportunity to correct some of these underlying challenges and inequalities we already were aware of. What kind of impact will that have on urban form, mobility, housing, the workplace, all these other issues we've been discussing?
Mm-hmm. Well, Richard is correct that so much of what's happened here has taken us by storm. I think in your introductory remarks, you said, in March, we thought this would be for a few weeks, and now here we are in July, and we're still remote. But we didn't necessarily take the steps that we needed to take to think proactively to the future, rather constantly trying to react and put out fires. And we really need to develop a vision and a plan for ensuring that we do come out better on the other side. And so, one of the really great things that happened early on was this notion that here we have people working in grocery stores, cashiers, stockists, people who you may not have thought of as a hero back in February, who all of a sudden in March and April were being celebrated and cheered for, and really sort of respected and acknowledged. And they were given an increase in their wages from minimum wage to a $2 increase per hour. And the grocery stores are people aren't eating in restaurants for the most part, and they're staying home. And so there's a lot more grocery purchasing happening than there was, and grocery store profits are rising. And yet that $2 wage was removed after the immediacy of the emergency was declared over. And so that's a real challenge and a problem, because that was an opportunity to provide people earning at the sort of the lowest floor of wages an opportunity for a small wage increase there, and we've taken that back. A second area is around mobility, and so we talked about public transit and fear of transit. We talked about are people moving more into private automobiles because it's safer, it's private, right? We've gone from wanting to be together to wanting to be in our very safe private spaces, but it's really negligent to encourage more people to commute by car. In fact, in cities, if we want to have cities in which there is a quality of life, we actually need to take more of the cars out. If you look at places that came back sooner in terms of places that return to work and urban life sooner than in North America, you look at China, for instance, and you look at return in mobility of how people were getting around. Private automobiles bounced back very quickly, where public transit much more slowly. Cycling bounced back to about where it was. Taxi and ride hailing a little bit lower than it was, but bigger increases in automobile use than anything else. And intention to buy automobiles has gone up. And so there was a study of intention to buy automobiles in China that showed a 2/3 increase. But there was a recent study I read about in New York that also showed increases in intention. And so we really need to think about, is encouraging everyone to get their own private car going to create a greater sense of equity? No, because it privileges those who can afford to do that, but it also forces people to make a choice around how to spend perhaps, a limited income, and then not being able to afford other things, or not being able to reach a sort of potential in other areas. So that's a real challenge there. But again, we need to have a stronger vision and a plan where we go beyond, Drive TO, which was just announced, where people can drive their cars to watch a concert or a movie in Toronto. And in a way, that's a wonderful opportunity for community building. But what about those who don't have cars? How can we, what about those who aren't in that location? How can we make sure to create other programs or additional programs or other kinds of supports that allow inclusion and more sort of opportunity for people to really participate there?
To build on what Shauna said on this issue of equity, I just think equity and economic recovery are so very nested. And just really quickly, if you look at this crisis, it has exposed deep inequities and injustices of race and class that we've just swept under the rug. The COVID-19 crisis, especially in the United States, but also in Canada, has barely touched professional knowledge workers. In fact, the one study in San Francisco in the Mission District, they could not find a professional or knowledge worker who either had the COVID-19 virus or had an antibody. The virus was massively concentrated among frontline service workers who happened to be Black, Latino, visible minority, new immigrant, and women. And it has devastated both at the individual level and community level communities of color. So in the United States, between 40 and 50% of COVID deaths have been, and think about that, these are have been Black or Latino. You look at the map of the United States or New York City or Toronto, and COVID-19 cases or deaths are massively concentrated in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And, the only upside of that is that people have said, we're not taking it anymore. Like it's over, and it took an act of police brutality, which, by the way, always catalyzes unrest in the United States. It's a long history. It took an act of police brutality to catalyze it. But you've seen this wave of protests, which is arguably the largest wave of protests, not only in the United States, but globally, that I've seen in my lifetime. So from a societal point of view or business point of view, it's a big wake-up call. We have got to take, if we want our economy to get back on track and our society to get back on track, we've got to make our society less inequitable. And I would say here is an area in which Toronto has done better. If you look at what's happened in Toronto compared to what's happened in New York or Minneapolis or Miami or Los Angeles, we can go down the list. Toronto just looks much better able to handle all of this in a way that maintains some level of equity, some level of inclusivity, and some level of social cohesion. So I think we really got to grapple with this, that we can't kick this back under the rug anymore. It's become too visible and too important to our economic, social, and political future.
Great. Let me just close this segment before we get to the Q&A. Close this segment by asking you each a kind of summary question, which is, at the end of the day, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the future of cities post-pandemic? Maybe I'll come back to you now, Shauna.
Sure. I feel optimistic about cities and their future, in part by necessity, because the alternative is very bleak. And I think that if we think positively and we work towards creating new structures, new strategies, new opportunities for power and change, this is a time of tremendous innovation and thinking and an opportunity for collaboration. And those are all positive things. If we look historically at the role that cities have played in economic growth, in wealth building, in prosperity, in bringing together and supporting migrant communities and religious communities and people, both young and old. I think our cities have a great future, and we still need to be intentional about how we get there. But there are things that can happen in cities that absolutely can't happen elsewhere, and particularly in some of the big, great cities where there, quite frankly, is a tremendous amount of power and ability to affect change.
I'm more and more optimistic with every passing day. I think that cities have, this pandemic, as tragic as it is far from the deepest crisis, economic crisis, health crisis, natural crisis that has faced cities. Cities have rebounded from far, far worse. The force of urbanization, its economic power, its role in innovation and creativity is just too powerful. I think that we now, cities have been sold for so long on their amenity value. Do they have cool restaurants or cool bars or, great places to go out? I think as those things become less attractive, cities shine for their productivity value. The notion that they bring together productive people, so it enables you to reprocess space that may have been given over to amenities for productive use. And by the way, even though some people would argue that a shift away from public amenities to private amenities benefits suburbs, I actually think that private amenities can be developed much more efficiently in cities because the talent pool is there. The one thing I would caution the audience, much of the writing about cities is written by Americans like me. The problems that confront American cities are quite unique. And I just want to make that point. I do think New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, never mind Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh, face a unique set of problems. Locally funded education, which we don't have here. We have provincially funded education, terrible urban schools. People are nervous about putting their kids in terrible schools for good reason. The lack of a social safety net, guns in every hand, and there has been an upswing in violence in Toronto, but not like the massive uptick in violence in the United States. So I would caution people, when they begin to say all cities are going to look like what's happening in XYZ US cities, I don't think we've seen the same level of disarray, if you will, or the same level of challenge to Toronto or London or Paris or Tokyo. We can go down the list, Stockholm or Berlin. So I would just say, I think the future is even rosier. If I'm optimistic about cities overall, I think when we talk about cities outside the United States, the future is even rosier.
Thanks. We'll turn to the Q&A now. We've got quite a number of questions that have been coming in and accumulating. So I'm going to pick a few from there. I want to start, I think, with this one, which is, I'm going to start with it because it crossed my mind as we were talking about it as well. So I'm going to pick this one out. There's a kind of an interesting problem, a kind of a challenge that arises when we talk about so Richard in particular talked about how people more advanced in their careers and with established networks and so on are likely to be the ones to take advantage of the opportunity to work remotely. But the younger people who need to build those networks, or more junior people who need to build those networks, may want to be in the office to make those connections. And yet, if you and I aren't there, who are the junior people going to be with in the office, and how are they going to make those connections? And what is that going to do to kind of the evolution of workplace networks? And maybe that has probably equity implications as well, and so on. So I've thought a little bit about that challenge.
It's a really, really good question and a vexing question. And, not one, I mean, it's a really good question because I'd never thought of it. So look, I think we now know that this generation, and not just this generation, it's been since 2005. It's not just been since the economic crisis that opportunity is narrowed. And this absence of mentors is a big, big part of it. So maybe that's an obligation. That's something that all of us have to take seriously, that we have to figure out ways as enterprises, as communities, as social actors to provide that. And let's make this very concrete. Let's not just talk about business people, academics. If we have remote conferences for the American Economic Association or American Sociological Association or whatever, the American Society of Urban Planning, how do young faculty members, junior faculty, develop those personal networks that are so important for their career advancements, for their letters? Yeah, I think this is a really important thing. It's not something I've thought of before. It's something I'll think of more, but I think this questioner has done something very important.
Yeah. Shauna, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to add that, I think I agree that people at mid-career and more advanced career stages, particularly those who work in knowledge-based industries, are far more capable of working from home productively because they already have their networks and their teams built. But and so I understand the challenge, particularly for people just entering the workforce and for anybody who's moving jobs or for anybody who needs to create a new team at some point, which is essentially everybody. And in order to create teams, we need to be able to have these kind of interpersonal face-to-face interactions. I've read in a few places people talking about, we need to remember about the strength of weak ties. How do you get your jobs, and how do you progress through your career? Often it's from someone and often it's not, it wasn't your mentor or somebody who you studied with for 20 years. Often it's someone who you just knew a little bit, but then they were able to connect you to another opportunity. And so in order to get back those weak ties and in order to be able to grow them, we actually need to go back to our offices. Most of the people that I've spoken to who work in law, in finance, in manufacturing and retail, they've all said that while their workplaces will change and they expect them to change, in part, they expect that people will have a little bit more flexibility. There is still the anticipation that once we figure out how to get people back together in person, whether that's in a year or 2 years from now, in larger numbers, that more and more people are returning to offices, that most workplaces are not going remote, that in some cases, this is an ability of the tech sector, and it's in part a way of attracting talent because of the very great competition for talent, more so than it is a saying goodbye to central cities. But I do think that it's not just the younger people. Sorry, but it's not just young people.
No,
it's really
Shauna,
everybody.
sorry.
We need to be able to sort of, we're working on the trust that we've built up in our teams, and we need to replenish that trust in those relationships at some point.
Yeah, the footnote I was going to put on that, Shauna, and sorry to interrupt, I thought you were ending, was the idea that it's not just in the workplace. To put this footnote, it's in the conference place. And as an academics, I know that most of my meaningful connections were made at conferences as a young scholar. And then I think about young techies, the role of things like South by Southwest. And those are going to be even harder to get back online, whether it's an academic conference or a South by Southwest conference. That's where people meet so many of these when you said weak ties, it was like this light bulb went off. That's where so many people make these connections, which are just hard to do in an online world. So that was my footnote on your big point.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question I was going to come back to here that it came a little bit in the question as it was asked out of something Richard said. But I think I was noticing the three of us, I think being at U of T, tend to think about the future of cities being the future of Toronto. And what it means to be a city means to be, a big city like Toronto. Richard mentioned being more worried about smaller cities and suburbs. The question asker highlighted that you talked about people, staying away from the core, which might imply they're in those smaller centers or in the suburbs, and yet at the same time you were worried about those. So they were kind of asking about that tension. But I just wanted to ask you both to reflect a little bit on what might be different if we were to think about smaller cities and not take quite as Toronto-centric a view.
Well, this is a problem I work on a lot, particularly in the US case. Jane Jacobs was so funny the great urbanist, when I asked her this, she said, well, Canada has like 3 cities. She was just being silly. The US has 350 metropolitan areas over 500,000, 50 metropolitan areas, 53 metropolitan areas over 1 million. It just has more. And when I look at that, if you have a great research university, if you're a small place like a college town, like Ann Arbor, Michigan, or Austin, Texas, and you have a great university, you're okay. If you're close to a major metropolitan area, like Hudson, New York, the beautiful Hudson Valley scenic areas outside of New York where people have second homes, you're okay. And thirdly, if you have a big, giant foundation, I'm personally doing work in Bentonville, Arkansas, where the Walton Family Foundation happens to be, which is investing literally billions of dollars into making Bentonville in Northwest Arkansas, hundreds of millions, like sums that would make sums that invested into the University of Arkansas that we've never seen in the Canadian context, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they have the George Kaiser Family Foundation, or Pittsburgh, where they have the Ellen and Heinz Foundations. But those are the examples. If you're a community that doesn't have that doesn't have a great research university, that isn't next to a thriving metropolitan or city center, that doesn't have a big local benefactor, you're in a tough spot. And you can try all you want to attract remote workers, but you just don't have the critical mass. So I think, people are saying, well, we're going to see this massive movement of people out to the hinterlands. I'm not so sure about that. I actually think the If you look at what's been happening up to the crisis, we see the consolidation of economic functions in big, look at the Canadian context, look at Toronto. The consolidation of economic functions in finance, real estate, technology in superstar cities. And my fear is that while people are hand waving about decentralization, that in fact, the ultimate outcome of this will be even more consolidation of those functions in big cities.
So I would add that, you know, in Ontario in particular, we've seen a lot of hand waving about the movement of people, particularly younger families, looking to purchase a house rather than live in a small apartment or condominium, moving to small and mid-sized cities elsewhere in Ontario. That the growth of the city of Toronto and the Toronto City region is actually exclusively taking place as a result of immigration and not as a result of natural population increase in the city, because there is this movement to smaller cities. However, if you look at the absolute numbers of people and families moving to London and moving to Kitchener-Waterloo, and then you look at the absolute number of people that live in the city of Toronto, what you see is that percentage-wise, it might look significant, but when you look at the absolutes, it's actually very small. The other thing is that we've seen, you know, I've seen this in the US, some mid-sized cities offering money to relocating workers. So I read somewhere Savannah, Georgia was offering $2,000 to attract people who can work remotely in Savannah. And, you know, we also saw Facebook say, well, if you want to move to a place where the cost of living is lower, then guess what? Your salary is also going to decrease. So it's a complicated kind of game and puzzle, and it's not entirely sort of simple or resolved. I think there will be movement of remote workers who are advanced enough in their careers to be able to look at other properties. But I think in the end, I'm sorry to disagree with you, Richard, on this. I agree. We are going to see our city continue to grow.
Wanted to ask a question here that came from the Q&A about what specifically with respect to the built environment, what changes you might expect to see in the city as a consequence of the pandemic. I guess we should expect to see or would hope to see. Let's broaden that. The
biggest changes in cities that we've seen have tended to be changes in the built environment in response to pandemics. So some of those are macro changes, like the boulevards in Paris that were a result of Paris dealing with cholera epidemics. Some of those have been the investment in open space, investment in sewers and sanitation, and then at the more micro level, investment in building technology. You know, we did a great story at City Lab about the rise of the modern bathroom. And, you know, bathrooms were not always these tiled and stainless steel. This was an emulation of the hospital setting. Bathrooms were kind of cranky old wooden rickety places that were insterile. We did something about the powder room. You know, homes didn't have a powder room. Most of the bathrooms were on the second floors and third floors where the bedrooms were. The powder room was created as a place people could wash off the germs. Look, I think our cities, Toronto's going to look pretty much the same. It's not going to look all that different when you look at this skyline, but the way that space is used is going to change. We're going to see commercial buildings and retail buildings transformed into residential. We're going to see commercial office space spread out. We're not going to pack people like we used to do. We're going to see lanes of traffic giving over to cyclists. Shauna's already mentioned this. This is going to be the biggest physical change, I think, in cities that we'll see is this accelerant of cycling. I think there's just no way around this. I think we're going to see our city spilling outside. The other big one's going to be we're going to give over parking lots and streets. You know, I took my first walk to Yorkville. Believe this or not, folks, first time I almost walked to the university, but not quite that far. And I was amazed at the number of sidewalk cafes that had been set up throughout Yorkville. And we're going to just see more of that. That's happened in New York. Whole avenues are turned over. I think more open space. I think Shauna's hinted at this. Look, I think we can also be looking at not just retail and cafes outside. I think we can be looking at moving parts of the office outside. I've talked to a lot of commercial and office designers about what we can do. And, you know, in nice weather, you can do meetings, you can enable terraces and garden spaces and parking lots to have meetings. So I think these will be the big changes. And hopefully the hopeful one we talked about is, could we enable more 15-minute neighborhoods? Could we, and look, if you ask me what's made me happiest about, what's the silver lining, is my neighborhood in Toronto has come alive. My neighborhood used to be a place that was emptied of people during the day, and you just didn't see a soul. And now I see people from, not just my neighbors, people on bikes and walking, and my neighborhood has come alive with human beings and families. I think that's what could happen in the city of the future. We could make all neighborhoods, not just downtown neighborhoods, all neighborhoods come alive and be invigorated. So that's my hope.
Yeah, Shauna?
Absolutely, we are seeing public space being used in very different ways, and new thinking around what should happen in public space. 30% of most cities is comprised of streets, and streets are owned. They're public space, they're public land. They're typically owned by local governments. And we've given them over to, for the most part, private automobiles. And so we were thinking about how do we actually use that space more effectively, more efficiently? How do we make sure that that space serves our needs, our economy, our neighborhoods, our business people? And so we've seen a lot of commercial use on public space. We've seen a lot more sort of allowance for creating cafes in what were previously parking spots. We've seen a lot of cities move much more rapidly to bring cycling infrastructure on stream. And we've seen reuses of parking lots and parking spaces for markets, for cultural events and activities. We are going to be entering into a cold winter, presumably in the next 6 months. And I think that will be a really interesting experiment to see what will happen. Personally, I've become obsessed with whether or not I could build an outdoor office, because I've been looking at these beautiful images of outdoor sheds.
You can.
But the last thing I would say, and I haven't really seen much about this, I was speaking to a few people I know who lead different kinds of firms, and there were two of them, a tech entrepreneur and someone who is the head of a large sort of retailing firm. And they both are located in our industrial spaces, just on the shoulders of the CBD. And what they both said to me was, actually, their spaces are not a problem. They don't need to use elevators. Their buildings are 2 or 3 stories high. They have very spacious offices, and it's easy actually to get back to work if they can figure out how their employees can get there. So if they can solve for the public transit issue or the commuting issue, they actually can go back to work. And we're going to see a lot more pressure on how do we reuse those industrial spaces and making sure we don't tear them all down and build condominiums.
Super. Well, thanks so much to both of you for this great discussion. I'm afraid we've run to the end of our hour. I will ask you each if you have 1 minute's worth of final thoughts to share or so, and then we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. Shauna, do you have quick final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts are really a message of optimism and hope amidst a very challenging, difficult, and devastating time. And we need to be able to look around to see what it is we can do right now, whether it's the bike lanes, whether it's how to figure out how to make transit safe so that people can get back to work, whether it's opening up schools or ensuring that we address some of our big, wicked equity challenges. But we will get beyond this, and there is a future. There is a future for all of us, for our cities, for our companies, for our families, and for our communities. And so I look forward to that future, and I think I look forward to that future. I'll leave it there.
Super. Thanks.
Exactly what Shauna said. Exactly what Shauna said. First of all, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And if you read the Business Week story today about the Oxford virus, Oxford vaccine, they think they can get vaccine by fall. Now, that may be wishful thinking, but we're going to have better therapies and better vaccines. We are just so lucky that this is not the time of the Spanish flu or the cholera epidemic or what, my parents and grandparents had to live through. If we stay the course, 6 to 9 months, if we don't act like fools, if we do the right thing and we're careful, we're going to get through this, and we're going to have, in a place like Canada, a public health miracle. So that's number one. Number two, our cities are going to be fine. Toronto's going to be fine. But Shauna said, we've got to deal with these equity issues. I called it a new urban crisis, a crisis of success, a crisis of inequity, a crisis of unaffordability. The crisis, the COVID crisis has shined a light on how horrific this inequity is. Shame on us. Shame on us if we don't take advantage of it. And I just want to close with this. I remember when a predecessor of yours called me, Roger Martin, and said, Rich, do you think you might want to come to the University of Toronto? And we have this institute you could be a part of. And I said, oh, maybe. And I thought my wife lives in Michigan. My wife's family lives in Michigan. 12 years later, that just looks like a level of genius. And so I think the thing that I'm most grateful for is that I got the chance to come to Toronto. And, when I look back at what's happening in places like a very wealthy country like the United States, I think I'm very lucky that I made that decision to come here. And I think we can't take that for granted, that, for all of you listening in, this is Toronto has really shown, and I could bitch and moan about Toronto more than most people, right? American that I am. But boy, oh boy, one of my friends said, a place's true colors really show, they come through in a crisis. And I think I'm just really happy, in more than I could have thought a dozen years ago, that I chose to come to Toronto, the University of Toronto, and the Rotman School, and we're lucky to be here.
Well, thanks, Richard. I can sympathize with that as your fellow American immigrant to Toronto and beneficiary of Rotman's hiring spree in 10 to 20 years ago. Thank you both for this great discussion. I think there's a lot to be focused on, working on, a lot of improvements to be made, a lot of opportunities to take advantage of this crisis to make long overdue improvements in our cities, especially around equity. And I think you've both given us a lot to think about and a lot of hope for the future of cities. As I mentioned at the outset, this is our 10th episode in Managing Uncertainty in this webinar series. The next webinar will be Thursday, August 20th at 1 o'clock. We'll look at some of the challenges of returning to workplaces, and we'll be giving some thought to how to do that responsibly, thinking about the frontier between public health directives and managerial responsibility. Our guests for that session will be Professors Anita McGann and Avi Goldfarb. If you missed any of our previous webinars, you can find the recordings on our website at rotman.utoronto.ca. Thanks again to our guest panelists, and thanks again to all the audience for joining us today. Have a good day.